Though I am an author, I was first published as a translator, and I always say that there are many authors, but the work of the translator, at least in our languages that are non-hegemonic, is so important because it helps us connect. So I always give a lot of value to my work as a translator. And also as a scholar who has studied decolonial translation, it is a great pleasure for me to be in a place where there is such a rich tradition in metaphors, in ways of thinking about translation that are outside of the Western, very biblical approach to the author and the translation. And it's also a pleasure to be with translators I have read and whose work has contributed to my own understanding of literature and to accessing the writings of women in Southeast Asia. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to be the exotic one here because coming from the West is usually the other way around. So I'm very happy that I am the strange element in this panel. And I will just give a very simplified and very short history of the Galician language and translation within it. So Galician is a language spoken in the northwest of Spain, of the Iberian Peninsula actually. And Galician and Portuguese were the same language until the 14th century. It's a Latin-based language. And the languages were separated, but they're still quite close. And Galician is interesting because it was not a written language for 4 centuries. So due to political strife, the Galician nobles sided with the wrong side of, the history of what would later become Spain. And they were all expelled, and the clergy too. So Galician became the language of peasants and of people who didn't have access to education. So for 4 centuries, as I was saying, since the 14th century until the 18th, 19th century, Galician was not written. Then at the beginning, during the 19th century, was again used as a literary language, and I always emphasize that the first person to ever write in Galician again, unaware of the fact that Galician had been a very important language in the Middle Ages, was a woman. Her name is Rosalía de Castro, and she's an amazing poet, an amazing thinker, a feminist. I won't say before the time, because she was really a feminist, with a very deep intersectional thinking, we would say nowadays, in terms of class and ecology, etc. And translation after that, the literature started developing. We didn't have a standard until 1984, because we had a coup d'etat and a civil war and a dictatorship already in the 20th century. So we've had, in the previous panel, when I was hearing the history of Konkani, and I know many of the languages have gone through struggles like those, and we need to understand that to understand what translation means also. So for Galician, as I said, we didn't have a standard until the 20th century, until the 1980s, but translation started at the beginning of the 20th century. And the Galician nationalist movement was very keen on connecting. I'm a bit critical because the connection was on within Europe. So they were very interested in the Irish, liberation movement and the Irish nationalist movement. So they translated some of the Irish English language writers of the time. And since the 1980s, the translation was seen as a means to revive the language and the literature. So we initially decided to translate the classics. Me as a decolonial feminist translator have also many thoughts about that and who the classics are. But that was the initial trend. And now that we have a master's degree and a university that teaches translation into Galician, I think that the situation is a bit more diverse, and maybe we can talk about that later. I don't want to take up so much time, but this is just as some context for you to understand where I come from and what my language, what the situation of the language has been.